just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you liked those first two segments. Those are two very different wide receivers. Someone with a lot of hope entering a new chapter in his career in Evan Stewart, and someone who is more of a wild card in Travis Hunter. But for our third segment, I give you a bona fide number one wide receiver. One of my favorite college football wide receivers heading into this season, with a true opportunity to see his star ascend even more. This guy really developed a rapport starting off in high school. This is something I only just found out, where him and his quarterback really found a dynamic aspect of their game. And now, in a new season with a new head coach, mind you, he and his team are looking to really make waves in the Big 12, in a conference where anything can happen. And that player is, of course, Mr. Tetairoa McMillan. Oops, I gave a little preview of the next player. Tetairoa McMillan. Let's talk about him a little bit. I think that in terms of pure college football wide receivers, you can't get any better than having a guy like him on your roster. In terms of how Arizona plays as well, and how they played once his high school friend and quarterback Noah Fafita came in, really shows and tells the story of an Arizona team really looking to become dynamic. And this team, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most dynamic in all of college football, and they are going to surprise a lot of people even more this season. Because last season they snuck up on everybody once Fafita came into the picture. But now they're surprising no one. And their move to the Big 12 is a move that is sharp and smart for the direction of this program. Now, there are certain things that could slip up along the way for this program. And that is, they have a new head coach in Brent Brennan. Not necessarily tested in terms of Power 5 coaching. He did coach at SJSU and really helped them get into the national spotlight. But this is a different thing. If you're a coach coming into a program that hasn't really had that much success at the FBS level in college football and wants to get into the national spotlight, most importantly, you really have to have a nuanced approach. Because what Jed Fish did with this group last year was really indicative of a change in the narrative. It really showed what Arizona wants and desires to become in terms of national respect. And it all starts with this QB wide receiver duo in Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan. Last year, I wouldn't have been mad at you if you said that Tetairoa McMillan was not necessarily viewed as the number one wide receiver. He did play like a number one wide receiver for Arizona, but he had Jacob Cowing, who's gone to the NFL, in front of him. Now that Cowing is gone, this role is Tetairoa McMillan's to lose. And he's not going to. 90 catches last year, 1,402 yards, 10 TDs, 10.7 yards per target. His best game last year was against Mississippi State, 26.1 fantasy points, 8 catches, 161 yards, 1 touchdown. His worst game was against Stanford, where he only had 4 catches for 76 yards and 4.6 fantasy points. Now, when we think about the guys we talked about earlier, those are guys who really profile as filler to a fantasy roster. Tetairoa McMillan is someone that you're going to swing for the fences on. He's going to go very highly in a lot of fantasy college football drafts. In fact, he might go as the first wide receiver off the board, if you want my humble opinion. And the reason being is, when I think of how Arizona will profile this year, I don't necessarily know the offensive direction Brent Brennan might take, but I certainly know that you can't necessarily break up the duo of Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan. If you were to look at the rest of Arizona's roster, you wouldn't necessarily be able to pinpoint a player who truly stands out outside of Tetairoa McMillan. I don't know if Brent Brennan is going to diagnose that problem, but it's certainly not a problem that you feel will hinder Arizona because of the strength of Fafita and McMillan as a duo. But I think the whole reason that Tetairoa McMillan could be picked so highly is A, because they're in the Big 12, and B, there really is no one that I really view on this Arizona roster that can really elevate this team and get them into the national spotlight outside of him. He truly ascended his game last year to send Arizona into the national spotlight, and this year I think he's primed to do it again. Let's talk about this Arizona team in terms of how they will attack the Big 12. The Big 12 really suits them as a team in terms of what they bring to the table. If we look at all the other teams in the Big 12, you look at the teams that have been there already, in Kansas State, Oklahoma State, teams of that nature. You think about teams that have tried to build through this process, and Arizona has done just that. They might not be at the level. Some of you might think, well, Arizona didn't necessarily have to work that hard. You know what I mean? They kind of stumbled into this dynamic duo, and they really got going again. But if you really break it down, not only does Arizona profile as a Big 12 team through and through, they are the quintessential Big 12 team, and here's why. If you think about Big 12 teams, like I said about teams before, Big 12 teams don't predicate themselves on QB wide receiver duos. Now, you might be wondering why now I think that Arizona is the quintessential Big 12 team. It's not necessarily about the duo. It's about the necessity that Fafita and McMillan bring to each other. They feed off each other. And that's what I hope Brent Brennan will diagnose. Because at the end of the day, Tetairoa McMillan's job shouldn't be in jeopardy as the wide receiver one for this offense. But it definitely could be sullied by Brent Brennan not viewing this duo as the main hope of this team. I'm not saying that Arizona's offense is bad outside of McMillan. It's just that one guy out of all of these players might be needed to be elevated, and Tetairoa McMillan did that to a T. And so, looking at the Big 12, I think that the reason why I'm not sleeping on Arizona again this year is because if I look at all these teams, they might get caught up in distribution of wealth. If you look at Kansas State, for example, they're incorporating Avery Johnson into this offense. They have so many good pieces, a lot of talented pieces. But are they guys who elevate or guys who really need that production to sustain their levels of success? I look at Oklahoma State. Yeah, Ollie Gordon II was fantastic last year. Yeah, he really stepped up. But it was anomalous because Alan Bowman really didn't step up. There were a lot of question marks surrounding how Big 12 teams use and utilize their best players. And with Arizona, I don't really view that as a question mark. Tetairoa McMillan is going to receive the lion's share of the targets in this team, and they will be better for it. And I can't say that about many Big 12 teams. And I know it's weird to talk about a guy who really tips the balance in terms of balanced wide receiver rooms, because he's someone who really wasn't seen as a wide receiver one last year, but this year is the year where Arizona becomes a team that you're not necessarily worried about in terms of outside production. If Brent Brennan allows this Fafita McMillan connection to breathe, if he sees that Jed Fish was right to really hone in on allowing Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan to understand each other, then this team is going to be very dangerous. And when I think about the wide receiver profile in college football, outside of, trying to build balanced wide receiver rooms, let's talk about the wide receiver ones in college football for a little bit. If you go through recent history and you look at examples of receivers who really transcended what it means to have parity in a wide receiver room, you look at a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., who really actually limited Emeka Egbuka last year. If you look at maybe Devontae Smith, where in his final season he vaulted his status, won the Heisman because of it, in fact. When you look at players of that nature, it really makes sense to allow them to be the superstars they are. Because at the end of the day, that's where you actually get a lot of variation from. If you have a wide receiver so scary that they're so dominant that they get the lion's share of targets every single game, they're the number one receiver on their team, then that allows for other players to come into the spotlight, to come into the public eye. That's what Tetairoa McMillan does. He's going to add more value in terms of fantasy by allowing his teammates to shine in certain moments than him actually being the go-to receiver, if that makes sense. But he still is going to be the go-to receiver, and he still is going to put up a lot of stats. It's just that the way he plays allows for a lot more parity, if that makes sense, a lot more variation, because if Noah Fafita and McMillan's connection rings true, that it's more dangerous because of what's not happening. Now you have to account for players that you usually would have homed in on a lot more, being like, okay, if we can lock them down, maybe then Fafita won't distribute the ball to them. You're so focused on McMillan that you lose other players. And so that's the value that McMillan brings, not just in real life or in fantasy, but to the value of the sport itself. And I know I'm kind of rambling on about what it means to be this kind of wide receiver, but it really does matter, especially when you're pinpointing certain aspects of your fantasy football team. If you really want a solid wide receiver one, perhaps the best in college football, then by all means, Tetairoa McMillan will be your guy. But at the end of the day, the reason why I'm presenting all three of these kind of receivers in the way that I did is because you certainly have to have a sense of optimism about what you think these players will be. And if not, that it could be detrimental to how you draft. Tetairoa McMillan, out of all of those players I mentioned today, perhaps the best. But supplementing the best is what could be key. That's just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we have a player I'm actually very familiar with, played in the state of Jersey in high school, now making a name for himself still in Jersey as one of the most underrated running backs in the country. You definitely don't want to miss this next segment because he could be a hidden gem in fantasy college football.